A real Durwan. Burima, sweeper of the stairwell, had not slept in 2 nights. So the morning before the third night, she shook the mites out of her bedding. She shook the quilts once underneath the letter boxes where she lived, then once again at the mouth of the alley, causing the crows who were feeding on the vegetable peels to scatter in several directions. As she started up the 4 flights of the roof, Burima kept one hand placed over the knee that swelled at the start of every rainy season. That meant that her bucket, quilts, and the bundle of reeds which served as her broom all had to be braced under one arm. Lately, Burima had been thinking that the stairs were getting steeper. Climbing them felt more like climbing a ladder than a staircase. She was 64 years old, with a hair in a knot no longer than a walnut, and she looked almost as narrow from the front as she did from the side. In fact, the only thing that appeared three-dimensional about Burima was her voice, brittle with sorrows as tarts as curds and shrill enough to grate meat from coconut. It was with this voice that she enumerated twice a day as she swept the stairwell the details of her plight and losses suffered since her deportation to Calcutta after partition. At that time, she maintained the turmoil had separated her from a husband, 4 daughters, a 2 story brick house, a rosewood almari, and a number of coffer boxes whose skeleton keys she still wore, along with her life savings, tied to the free end of her sari. Aside from her hardships, the one thing Burima liked to chronicle was easier times. And so by the time she readied the second floor landing, she had already drawn the whole building's attention, the menu of her third daughter's wedding night. We married her to a school principal. The rice was cooked in rose water. The mayor was invited. Everybody washed their fingers in pewter bowls. Here she paused, evened out her breath, and readjusted the supplies under her arm. She took the opportunity also to chase a cockroach out of the banister poles, then continued. Mustard prawns were steamed in banana leaves. Not a delicacy was spared. Not that this was an extravagance for us. At our house, we ate goat twice a week. We had a pond on our property, full of fish. By now, Purima could see some light from the roof spilling onto the stairwell. And though it was only 8 o'clock, the sun had already strong enough to warm the last of the cement steps under her feet. It was a very old building, the kind with bath water that still had to be stored in drums, windows without glass, and privy scaffolds made of bricks. A man came to pick our dates and guavas, another clipped hibiscus, yet there was tasted life. Here I ate my dinner from a rice pot. At this point, the recital Purima's ears started to burn. A pain chewed through her swollen knee. Have I mentioned that I crossed the border with just 2 bracelets on my wrist? Yet there was a day when my feet touched nothing but marble. Believe me, don't believe me, such comforts you cannot even dream them. Whether there was any truth in Burima's litanies, no one could be sure. For one thing, every day the perimeters of her former estate seemed to double, as did the contents of her almari and the coffer boxes. No one doubted she was a refugee. The accent in her Bengali made that clear. Still, the residents of this particular flat building could not reconcile Purima's claims to prior wealth alongside the more likely account of how she had crossed the East Bengal border with the thousands of others on the back of a truck between sacks of hemp. And yet there were days when Purima insisted that she had become to Calcutta on a bullock cart. Which was it? By truck or by cart? The children sometimes asked her on their way to play cops and robbers in the alley. To which Purima would reply, shaking the free end of her sari so that the skeleton keys rated. Why demand specifics? Why scrape lime from a beetle leaf? Believe me, don't believe me. My life is composed of such griefs you cannot even dream them. So she garbled facts, she contradicted herself, she embellished almost everything. But her rants were so persuasive, her fretting so vivid, that it was not so easy to dismiss her. What kind of landowner ended up sweeping stairs? That was what Mr. Dalal of the third floor always wondered as he passed Burima on his way to and from the office where he filed receipts for a wholesale distributor of rubber tubes, pipes, and valve fittings in the plumbing direct district of College Street. Bichara, she probably constructs tales as the way of mourning the loss of her family was a collective surmise of most of the wives. And Burima's mouth is full of ashes, but she's a victim of changing times, was a refrain of old Mr. Chatterjee. He had neither strayed from his balcony nor opened newspapers since independence, but in spite of this fact, or maybe because of this, his opinions were always highly esteemed. The theory eventually circulated that Burima had once worked as hired help for a prosperous zamindar back east and was therefore capable of exaggerating her past at such elaborate lengths and heights. Her throaty impostures hurt no one. All agreed that she was a superb entertainer. In exchange of her lodging below the letter boxes, Burima kept their crooked stairwell spotless clean. Most of all, the residents liked that Burima, who slept each night behind the collapsible gate, stood guard between them and the outside world. No one in this particular flat building owned much worth stealing. The second floor widow, Mrs. Mishra, was the only one with a telephone. Still, the residents were thankful that Burima patrolled activities in the alley, screened the itinerant peddlers who came to sell combs and shawls from door to door, was able to summon a rickshaw at a moment's calling, and could, with a few slaps of her broom, root any suspicious character who strayed into that area in order to spit, urinate, or cause some other trouble. In short, over the years, Purima's service came to resemble those of a real Durwan. Though under normal circumstances this was no job for a woman, she honored the responsibility and maintained a vigil no less punctilious than if she was a gatekeeper of the house on Lower Circular Road or Jodhpur Park or any other fancy neighborhood. On the rooftop, Purima hung her quilts over the clothesline, the wires strung diagonally from one corner to the parapet of the other, stretched across her view of television antennas, billboards, and the distant arcs of Howrah Bridge. Purima consulted the horizon on all four sides. She ran the tap at the base of the cistern. She washed her face, rinsed her feet, and rubbed 2 feet over her 2 fingers over her teeth. After this, she started to beat the quills on each side with her broom. Every now and then she stopped and squinted at the cement, hoping to identify the culprit of her sleepless nights. She was so absorbed in this process that it was some moments before she noticed Mrs. Dalal of the third floor, who had come to set a tray of salted lemon peels out to dry in the sun. Whatever is inside this quilt is keeping me awake at night, Burima said. Tell me, where do you see them? Mrs. Dalal had a soft spot for Burima. Occasionally she gave the old woman some ginger paste with which to flavor her stews. I don't see anything, Mrs. Dalal said after a while. She had diaphanous eyelids and very slender toes with rings on them. Then they must have wings, Burima concluded. She put down her broom and observed one cloud passing behind another. They fly away before I can squash them. But just see my back. I must be purple from their bites. Mrs. Dalal lifted the drape of Burima's sari, a cheap white weave with a border the color of a dirty pond. She examined the skin above and below her blouse, cut in a style no longer sold in shops, and she said, Burima, you are imagining things. I tell you, these mites are eating me alive. It could be a case of prickly heat, Mrs. Dalal suggested. At this, Burima shook the free end of her sari and made her skeleton keys rattle. She said, I know prickly heat. This is not prickly heat. I haven't slept in 3, perhaps 4 days. Who can count? I used to keep a clean bed. Our linens were muslin. Believe me, don't believe me, our mosquito nets were as soft as a silk. Such comforts, you cannot even dream them. I cannot dream them, Mrs. Dalal echoed. She lowered her diaphanous eyelids and sighed. I cannot dream them, Burima. I live in 2 broken rooms, married to a man who sells toilet parts. Mrs. Dalal turned away and looked at one of the quilts. She ran a finger over the part of the stitching, then she asked, Burima, how long have you slept on this bedding? Burima put a finger on her lips before replying that she could not remember. Then why no mention of it until today? Do you think it's beyond us to provide you with clean quills? And oilcloths, for that matter? She looked insulted. There is no need, Burima said. They are clean now. I beat them with my broom. I'm hearing no arguments, Mrs. Dalal said. You need new bed, quilts, and a pillow, a blanket when the winter comes. As she spoke, Mrs. Dalal kept track of necessary items by touching her thumb to the pads of her fingers. On festival days, the poor came to our house to be fed, Burima said. She was filling her bucket with a coal heap on the other side of the roof. I will have a word with Mr. Dalal when he returns from the office, Mrs. Dalal called back as she headed towards down the stairs. Come in the afternoon, I will give you some pickles and some powder for your back. It's not prickly heat, Burima said. It was true that prickly heat was common during the rainy season, but Burima preferred to think that when irritated her bed, what stole her sleep, what burned like peppers across her thinning scalp and skin, was of less mundane origin. She was ruminating on these things as she swept the stairwell. She always worked from top to bottom when it started to rain. It came slapping across her roof like a boy in slippers too big for him and washed Mrs. Dalal's lemon peels into the gutter. Before pedestrians could open their umbrellas, it rushed down collars, pockets, and shoes. In that particular flat building, in all the neighboring buildings, creaking shutters were closed and tied with petticoat strings to the window bars. At the time, Budima was working all the way down in the second floor landing. She looked up the ladder like stairs, and as the sound of the failing water tightened around her, she knew her quilts were turning into yogurt. But then she recalled a conversation with Mrs. Dalal. And so she continued, at the same pace, to sweep the dust, cigarette ends, and lozenge wrappers from the rest of the steps, until she reached the letter boxes at the bottom. To keep out the wind, she rummaged through her baskets for some newspaper and crammed them into the diamond shaped openings of the collapsible gate. Then, on her bucket of coals, she set her lunch to boil and monitored the flame with a plated palm fan. That afternoon, as was her habit, Purima reknotted her hair, untied the loose end of her sari, and counted out her life savings. She had just woken up from a nap of 20 minutes, which she had taken on a temporary bed made from newspapers. The rain had stopped, and now the sour smell that rises from wet mango leaves was hanging low over the alley. On certain afternoons, Purima visited her fellow residents. She enjoyed drifting in and out of the various households. The residents, for their part, assured Purima that she was always welcome. They never drew latch bars along their doors except at night. They went about their business, scolding children or adding up expenses or picking stones out in the evening rice. From time to time, she was handed a glass of tea. The cracker tin was passed at her direction, and she helped the children shoot chips from across the carom board. Knowing not to sit on the furniture, she crouched instead in the doorways and hallways and observed the gestures and manners in the same way a person tends to watch traffic in a foreign city. On this particular afternoon, Burima decided to accept Mrs. Dalal's invitation. Her back still itched even from napping on the newspapers, and she was beginning to want some prickly heat powder after all. She picked up her broom. She never felt quite herself without it, and was about to climb upstairs when a rickshaw pulled up to the collapsible gate. It was Mr. Dalal. The years he had spent filling the receipts had left him with purple crescents under his eyes, but today his gaze was bright. The tip of his tongue played between his teeth, and in the damp of his thighs he held two small ceramic basins. Burima, I have a job for you. Help me carry these basins upstairs. He pressed a folded handkerchief to his forehead and throat and gave the rickshaw driver a coin. Then he and Burima carried the basins all the way up to the third floor. It wasn't until they were inside the flat that he finally announced to Mrs. Dalal, to Burima, to a few other residents who had followed them out of curiosity, the following things: that his hours filling receipts for a distributor of rubber tubes, pipes, and wall fittings had ended, that the distributor himself, who craved fresher air and whose profits had doubled, was opening a second branch in Burdwan, and that following an assessment of his sedulous performance over the years, the distribution was promoting Mr. Dalal to manage the College Street branch. In his excitement on his way to home through the pumping district, Mr. Dalal had brought two basins. What are we supposed to do with two basins in a two-room flat? Mrs. Dalal demanded. She had already been sulking over her lemon peels. Who ever heard of it? I still cook on kerosene. You refuse to apply for a phone, and I have yet to see your fridge you promised when we married. You expect two basins to make up for all that? The argument that followed was loud enough that he heard all the way down to the letter boxes. It was loud enough and long enough to rise above a second spell of rain that fell after the dark. It was loud enough even to distract Purima as she swept the stairwell from top to bottom from a second time that day, and for this reason she spoke neither of her hardships nor of the easier times. She spent the night on the bed of newspapers. The argument between Mr. and Mrs. Dalal was still more or less in effect early the new morning when the barefoot team of workmen came in to install the basins. After a night of tossing and pacing, Mr. Dalal had decided to install one basin in the sitting room of their flat and another one in the stairwell of the building on the first floor landing. This way, everyone can use it, he explained from door to door. The residents were delighted. For years they had all brushed their teeth with stored water pouring from mugs. Mr. Dalal, meanwhile, was thinking a sink on the stairwell is sure to impress visitors. Now that he was a company manager, who could say who might be visiting the building? The workmen toiled for several hours. They ran up and down the stairs, ate their lunches squatting against the banister poles. They hammered, shouted, spat, and cursed. They wiped their sweats with the ends of their turbans. In general, they made it impossible for Burima to sweep the stairwell that day. To occupy the time, Burima retired to the rooftop. She shuffled through the parapets, but her hips were sore from sleeping on newspapers. After consulting the horizon on all four sides, she tore what was left of her quills into several strips and resolved to polish the banister poles at a later time. By early evening, the residents gathered to admire the day's labors. Even Burima was urged to rinse her hands under the clear running water. She sniffed. Our bath water was scented with petals and adders. Believe me, don't believe me, it was a luxury you can't dream. Mr. Dalal proceeded to demonstrate the basin's various features. He turned each faucet completely on and completely off, then he turned both faucets at the same time to illustrate the difference in water pressure. Lifting a small lever between the faucets and allowed water to collect in the basins if desired. The last word in elegance, Mr. Dalal concluded. A sure sign of changing times, Mr. Chatterjee reputedly admitted from his balcony. Among the wives, however, the resentment quickly grew. Standing in line to brush their teeth in the morning, each grew frustrated with having to wait her turn, for having to wipe the faucets after every use, and for not being able to leave her own soap and toothbrush tube on the basin's narrow periphery. The Dalals had their own sink. Why did the rest of them have to share? Is it beyond us to buy sinks of our own? One of them finally burst out one morning. Are the Dalals only ones who can improve the conditions of this building? Asked another. Rumors began spreading that, following their argument, Mr. Dalal had consoled his wife by buying her 2 kilos of mustard oil, a Kashmiri shawl, a dozen cakes of sandalwood soap, that Mr. Dalal had filed an application for a telephone line, and Mrs. Dalal had nothing but to wash her hands in her basin all day. As if it weren't enough, the next morning a taxi bound for Howrah station crammed its wheels onto the alley. The Dalals were going to Shimla for 10 days. Burima, I haven't forgotten. We will bring you back a sheep's hair blanket made in the mountains, Mrs. Dalal said through the open window of the taxi. She was holding a leather purse in her lap, which matched the Turkish border of her sari. We will bring two, cried Mr. Dalal, who was sitting beside his wife, checking his pockets to make sure his wallet was in place. Of all people who lived in that particular flat building, Burima was the only one who stood by the collapsible gate and wished them a safe journey. As soon as the Dalals were gone, the other wives began planning renovations of their own. One decided to barter a stack of her wedding bracelets and commissioned a whitewasher to freshen the walls of the stairwell. Another pawned her sewing machine and summoned an exterminator. A third went to a silversmith and sold back a set of pudding bowls. She intended to have the shutters painted yellow. Workers began to occupy this particular flat building day and night. To avoid the traffic, Burima stood to the sleeping door on the rooftop so that many people passed in and out of the collapsible gate. So many others clogged the alley at all times, and there was no point in keeping track of them. After a few days, Burima moved her baskets and her cooking bucket to the rooftop as well. There was no need to use the basin downstairs, for she could just as easily wash, as she always had, from the cistern tap. She still planned to polish the banister poles with the strips she had torn from her quilts. She continued to sleep on her newspapers. More rains came. Below the dripping awning, the newspaper pressed over her head. Burima squatted and watched the monsoon ants as they marched along the clothesline carrying eggs in their mouths. Damper wedding soothed her back. Her newspapers were running low. Her mornings were long, her afternoons longer. She could not remember her last glass of tea. Thinking neither of her hardships nor of the earlier times, she wondered when the Dalals would return with her new bedding. She grew restless on the roof, and so for some exercise, Burima started aiding the neighborhood in the afternoons. Reed broom in her hand, sari smeared with newspaper ink, she wandered through markets and began spending her life savings on small treats. Today, a packet of puffed rice. Tomorrow, some cashews. The day after that, a cup of sugarcane juice. One day, she walked as far as bookstalls in the college street. The next day, she walked even further to produce markets in Bow Bazaar. It was there while she was standing in a shopping arcade surveying jackfruits and persimmons that she felt something tugging on the free end of her sari. When she looked, the rest of her life saving and her skeleton keys were gone. The residents were waiting for Burima when she returned that afternoon at the collapsible gate. Baleful cries tang up and down the stairwell, all echoing the same news. The basin on the stairwell had been stolen. There was a big hole in the recently whitewashed wall, and a tangle of rubber tubes and pipes sticking out of it. The chunks of plaster littered the landing. Burima gripped her broom and said nothing. In their haste, the residents practically carried Burima up the stairs to the roof, where they planted her on the side of the clothesline and started screaming at her from the other. "This is all her doing," one of them hollered, pointing at Burima. She informed the robbers. Where was she when she was supposed to guard the gate? For days she had been wandering the streets, speaking to strangers, another reported. We shared our coal, gave her a place to sleep. How could she betray us in this way? A third wanted to know. Though none of them spoke directly to Burima, she replied, believe me, I did not inform the robbers. For years we have put up with your lies, they retorted. You expect us now to believe you? Their recriminations persisted. How would they explain it to the Lals? Eventually, they sought the advice of Mr. Chatterjee. They found him sitting on his balcony watching a traffic jam. One of the second floor residents said, Burima had endangered the security of this building. We have valuables. The widow of Mrs. Maestra lives alone with her phone. What should we do? Mr. Chatterjee considered their arguments. As he thought things over, he adjusted the shawl that was wrapped around his shoulders and gazed at the bamboo scaffolding that now surrounded his balcony. The shutters behind him, colorless for as long as he could remember, had been painted yellow. Finally, he said, Burima's mouth is full of ashes, but this is nothing new. What is new is the face of this building. What a building like this needs is a real Durwan. So the residents tossed her buckets and rags, her baskets and reed broom down the stairwell, past the letter boxes, through the collapsible gate into the alley. Then they tossed out Burima. All were eager to begin their search for a real Durwan. From the pile of belongings, Burima kept only her broom. Believe me, she only said once more as her figure began to recede. She shook the free end of her sari, but nothing rattled.